Chapter 18 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Murder. It was early in December, and the weather had turned bitterly cold. True, the sun shone by day and made walking a delight, but several degrees of frost spellbound each night, and coated the bare woods and hedges in a radiant veil of sparkling silver. Agnes Howard had suggested 10 days in London, but Mrs. Davenant had rejected the proposal. "I haven't the least inclination to go to town," she had retorted rather crossly. "Then why not let us invite a cheery party to come here?" urged Agnes. "We always intended to have some house parties, and we've had none. We seem to have settled down into an utterly humdrum existence. Soon we'll find ourselves attending all the mothers' meetings and tending our own cabbages." "Oh, have any one you like, Agnes, but not on my account. I'm perfectly satisfied with the lives we lead, and thankful for the rest," was the quiet retort. Miss Howard had suggested a change as a means of cheering up her companion. Hilda had developed a curious moodiness, and took long walks alone by preference. She seemed to be plunged in constant thought, and her spirits had lost their bright resilience and sparkle. Agnes could not decide what ailed her. Was it that she missed Claude Carleton's frequent visits and obvious admiration, or was it something secret and undisclosed that weighed upon her mind? Miss Howard was inclined toward the latter interpretation. Major Carleton had written several times to Mrs. Davenant. A regular correspondence seemed to have sprung up between them, and his return had been announced by his mother as being due in about 10 days' time. Already Mrs. Carleton was planning a big Christmas dinner party and a dance to follow. There would be a cheery house party and possibly skating. It looked like a hard winter. This bright prospect ought to have raised Hilda's spirits in place of depressing them, but there was no change perceptible. In vain did the devoted Agnes seek to probe the mysterious cause of Hilda's depression. The only reply on putting a plain question was, "No, I've nothing more on my mind than usual, but recollect that I always carry with me a heavy weight." "Oh, it's hardly affected you in the past. Why should it do so now?" "You are looking pale and fagged," urged Agnes. "I suppose you won't like my saying so, but I sometimes regret bitterly that we ever came here. We should have steered clear of the lake house and its ill-omened traditions, instead of settling down at its very gates. I believe its proximity depresses you, even though it has turned out there is no ghost, and you have discovered Letty Thorne." Mrs. Davenant seemed to ponder these words, and Agnes, who was watching her closely, saw her colour deepen and then fade. Looking up, she met the gaze of her friend and said quietly, "I am glad, very glad we did come here. I have found Letty, but I feel very often and very strongly that we were sent here. I mean that a power other than our own directed us, and that there is a purpose in our living at Little Glentworth." "What sort of purpose?" persisted Agnes. She expected that the answer to her question would have some connection with Carleton and Hilda's avowed liking for him, but she was mistaken. "I feel a very strong conviction that the lake house will solve the problem of my life and the terrible uncertainty of years," was Hilda's quiet reply. "I don't understand. How could it?" demanded the perplexed Agnes. "I don't know. I only tell you what I feel. I've nothing to go on." Harry had returned to London with the happy prospect of a Christmas holiday at Little Glentworth, but there had been long discussions between the two ladies, Letty and Warburton, upon the lake house mystery. Agnes and the parson, on hearing that, as he supposed, the ghost was none other than Geoffrey Thorpe, had inclined to the belief that there was nothing more to learn, and that the so-called mystery did not exist. After all, there was nothing very unusual in the behaviour of the old man. Everyone knew how eccentric he was, and rambling about his own house in the dead of night was a perfectly legitimate amusement. "Why shouldn't he?" argued Warburton. Probably he sleeps badly. Probably he's full of suspicious fears and dread of burglars, a common enough condition of mind in those who lead secluded lives. In any case, it is indisputable that he has a perfect right to please himself, and as his nocturnal rambles no longer alarm you, why worry any more?" Letty listened respectfully to those logical remarks, but remained quite unshaken by them. "I don't worry. After all, it isn't my affair," she said. "And when I hear the footsteps I no longer feel afraid, and often they don't even waken me. But I'm more than ever convinced that there is a mystery. Though I no longer expect to see a ghost, I can't help feeling a deep dread of the whole place. It is weighed down by some horrible secret. The whole atmosphere is impregnated with mystery. No one could live under that roof and fail to sense it. Something sinister is concealed there. What, I don't know. I can't even imagine." "It can be no human being. Such things happened perhaps in a less enlightened past. They couldn't happen now. They would be discovered," argued Warburton with conviction. "I discussed with Harry the possibility of someone being hidden or kept prisoner in the lake house. He agreed with me that such a presumption was quite untenable. Recluse as Mr. Thorpe undoubtedly is, certain people do approach and often enter his house. Mrs. Greatorex lives there. The gardener is in and out, and has been about the place for years. The tradesmen and postmen come to the door. There are old retainers still on the property. Repairs must sometimes be executed, or the roof would fall in." Agnes Howard warmly emphasized these contentions, but Letty remained obviously unconvinced, and apparently Hilda Davenant took Letty's view. She listened very quietly to all the arguments, but took no part in them, nor did she once express agreement with Warburton and Agnes. She also was unconvinced. The short winter day was closing, as she sank down with a tired little sigh on the seat of the old summer-house by the lake. The air had a sharp nip in it, and the deepening orange which suffused the western sky and spread into a vast crimson canopy in the upper heavens warned her that the day was done. She had no fear of being surprised in that deserted spot, sacred only to the love-making of Harry and Letty. The girl never came there alone, and it was too cold for the old man to be out. He had left the house but once that year, when he had surprised the lovers. The trysting-place was now abandoned to wild nature, but it had a singular attraction for Hilda Davenant. Her thoughts flew freely there, and the utter solitude was restful to a woman who had spent all her life in public and was rarely off guard. For some time now she had been obsessed by the conviction that the one great difficulty in her life would find its solution there. She made no attempt to speculate as to how this would come about. That was a secret held by her other self, the self that gave rise to the conviction and had a wisdom of its own. She was content to drift, to wait patiently on fate, and surrender herself to that imperious urge which drove her so often to the gloomy fringe of the lake. Often she had asked herself the question, "What draws me here? What is the shadow that has crossed my path and darkened once more my future outlook? I had begun to forget, and now I am again enveloped in the shadow of the past." Instinctively she felt that it was a shadow. Could it be the same shadow that darkened Letty's life at the lake house, and which caused her to long for the moment when she could leave it? Was this same shadow operating upon her in an exactly contrary degree? It came to her that imagination was floating farther and farther away, with her yearnings and desires in a wind of dreams. To what port was she being wafted? Was it to a land of shades and still deeper resignation, or to a harbour of sunshine, where dreams of joy would find their fruition? The sun had finished his short circuit, and had left a crimson trail of glory behind him in the frosty sky. Against the northern horizon were piled up great grey masses of cloud tinged with carmine and gold. The wooded heights surrounding the lake were transformed into a fairy forest of hoar-frosted boughs and stark leaves. King Winter reigned supreme, and had silenced the merry chatter of the little brooks and draped the brown fern fronds and overhanging foliage in silver, a miracle of fantastic and delicate tracery. The lake was covered by a thin film of ice, save where deep springs welled up from its depths. Its surface reflected lovely lights, opal tints of carmine, gold, steely blue, and deep rose, and Mrs. Davenant watched them slowly fading into the colder, purer radiance of a full moon, now climbing above the woods, while the zenith was still rosy and gold. She was about to tear herself away from the silent enchantment and retrace her steps homewards, when the deep peace was broken by a startled blackbird, messenger of storms, darting wildly out from its roosting-place. It flew screaming across the lake and disappeared into the black shadows beyond. She stood up just within the entrance of her shelter and listened intently. Her heart began to beat, and a thrill of violent excitement flashed through her. There was not a sound. Yet surely now she could hear something in the dim distance. A sound like the sharp crack of broken twigs and branches. Again another sound, muffled yet drawing nearer. The rapid padding of feet, unshod or lightly slippered feet. Hilda held her breath and drew back within the doorway. Instinctively she turned to a wide crack in the rotten wood, through which she could see without being seen. Her eyes sought the twisting woodland path to the left, from whence the sound came. It was the Ghost's Walk, and led eventually to the house, about a quarter of a mile away. The moon was rising higher now, and was shining almost vertically down upon the lake. It illumined the scene with a clear, cold radiance, throwing light and shadow into sharpest relief. The running, padded footsteps drew nearer. Surely another moment and their owner would round the bend and appear in view. Fleet though they were, they suggested weariness. There was a decided limp in their action. A deadly terror of she knew not what shook Hilda Davenant like a withered leaf assailed by autumn winds. The runner tore round the bend, coming on as if flying for dear life. Now the fugitive was in full view, and revealed as a man, or rather the ghost of what had once been a man. He was very tall and strongly built, but worn to a shadow, and apparently fagged out. Still he held on his way. Now he had passed out of Mrs. Davenant's range of view, and barely conscious of her actions, she crept nearer the entrance and peered out as he approached. He was quite close to her now, and as she stood transfixed, staring towards him, every drop of blood left her face, which became rigid with horror. One arm swung free as he ran. On his other side hung an empty sleeve. His face was grey, haggard, and covered by a mat of unkempt black hair. His clothes hung in rags about his gaunt frame, and on his feet were tattered stockings. She stood as if frozen to the ground, dizzy from unadulterated fear. Then the film gathering over her eyes cleared. The nightmare spasm clutching at her breath loosed its hold at the violence of overwhelming shock. The flying figure had stopped short, and for one long moment the wild dark eyes, charged with an expression that curdled her blood, met hers in full recognition. At that awful gaze the beating of her heart ceased. Surely the earth stood still too. Surely the moon paused in her mounting. Then before she could call back her senses, before a word was spoken, he was off again. She staggered back to the seat and cowered into its black shadows. Had he recognized her? Oh, yes, undoubtedly. She could tell it by that hideous stare of amazed loathing. She had changed hardly at all since last they met 12 years ago. She had recognized him instantly, and yet he had changed enormously. She threw her hands before her face. More in thought is suffered in eventful moments than in years of tranquillity. Yet such lightning flashes of time colour whole lives and turn the tide of destinies. Only about 30 seconds had elapsed. Terror leapt alive once more. The running feet were returning, and she strangled the scream that rose in her throat, and hid the whiteness of her face while she shrank farther into the shadows, which engulfed her so completely that it seemed as if she herself were but a shadow, absorbed and lost in deeper shadows. He was returning to kill her. For a second it flashed across her that the tread was not the same. Another fugitive was passing. But the blood throbbed in her brain, the roar of the sea sounded in her ears. She could not reason or be sure of anything. The momentary terror had passed so swiftly it was like an illusion of the senses, leaving her stunned with nightmare thoughts. Yet she knew it was no nightmare she was passing through. Stark reality had to be faced. Nothing could soften or avert it. This was the hour she had awaited, and instinctively she had known that from it there was no escape. The veil which hid the ominous shadow had been torn aside. It was real flesh and blood. This had been the destiny mapped out for her. She felt nothing now but a dreary desire to die, for she had rushed upon her fate in its most humiliating aspect. Again acute terror rushed back. The silence was broken. She listened intently. Was he returning? How could she escape? For he had gone by the road she had to traverse, and she was compelled to hide in her dark shelter till he had gone clear away. She bent her head forward and strained her ears in an agony of apprehension. Yes, there was something moving at the other end of the little lake. Again came the shrill scream of startled birds. A hare sped swiftly past the door. Though she could see nothing because of a bend in the path and the tangled foliage, she could clearly distinguish the brittle noise of cracking ice, a heavy splash of water, and a low discordant medley of sound, confused and intermittent, rising, falling. It sounds like a dog-fight in the distance, she thought, shudderingly. She dared not move from her hiding-place. Yes, he was still there. What was he doing? What were those sinister, confused sounds? Would he come back? The terror of his return overpowered all other thoughts, all clear reasoning. If he did return, he would surely kill her. Of that alone she was certain. Hours seemed to pass, dragging interminably. The strange sounds had died out, and a blessed period of deep silence reigned once again. In reality, but 10 minutes had slipped by, and she was about to steal forth to reconnoitre, when she became aware for a certainty that someone was approaching. The footsteps were assuredly not his. She clutched at the doorposts for support. A weight was on her head and all her numbed limbs. She was no longer quite certain of anything. The steps were dragging and slow, the halting steps of a very old, unshod man, and peering out she saw gradually emerge from the black shadows not that tall gaunt fugitive with the wild dark stare of recognition, but an aged man with down-drooped head, leaden limbs, and spiritless air. The moonlight fell full upon him now, and enveloped him in glittering raiment, for as he came closer she saw that from head to foot he streamed with water. Geoffrey Thorpe! She was certain of the identity of the man she suddenly faced. Clarity rushed over her. She moved from the shadows and barred his path. "What have you done with Mark Thorpe?" she demanded. He was standing as if rooted, like the stark trees around him. The day of judgment had dawned. That imperious question came from an archangel's trump, calling him to his just doom. He raised his haggard eyes and looked straight into her face, a pale, beautiful, accusing face, and she noted on his a quivering, deadly pallor. There was neither tragedy nor pathos in his gaze, only pity, which trembled in his voice like a condemned soul brought to justice. "I have killed him," he replied, with dull, leaden brevity. "You have drowned him in the lake?" He looked again at her darkly. "He is drowned in the lake. A one-armed man cannot swim, but I never meant to kill him. We fought near the edge. We slipped on the frozen ground as we grappled. We both fell in, and he clutched with his one hand at my foot as we sank together. I struck away his hand with a desperate effort. I would have saved him, but I was choking. He sank again. Oh, what matters? I, too, am a dead man." His voice was dead and expressionless. His face, white as a corpse against the black shadows, was devoid of feeling. He moved slowly, silently, and painfully on, without another word or gesture. He wore no shoes, only torn stockings. She watched him as his spectral form was swallowed up in the darkness of the woodland path. For a long moment she stood still, and then she looked down upon the frozen ground. A little pool of water had gathered where a moment before he had stood. End of chapter 18.